Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin suggested this as the motto for the Great Seal. But how did the Founding Fathers arrive at this conclusion of political and theological thought? Chapter 6 of Daniel Dreisbach's 2017 book, Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers, published by Oxford Scholarship, discusses how the theological theory on resistance to tyrannical government evolved from the Protestant Reformation to the eve of the American Revolution. Dreisbach starts out by talking about Martin Luther and John Calvin, two of the most influential leaders of the Protestant Reformation. He says that their interpretations of the Bible were fairly similar on their ideas behind resistance to a tyrannical government. They believed that civil government's authority was ordained from God, and it was the Christians' duty to submit to that authority unless it was contrary to God's law. But they both believed that passive resistance should be the Christians' response to a tyrannical government. The Protestant Reformation, as it grew, caused some violent conflicts in Europe. And according to Dreisbach, between 1550 and 1650, there was a lot of Protestant leaders. They were in exile. They wrote what he called the resistance literature. Some of these were John Ponette, John Knox, and Christopher Goodwin. This literature transitioned the thought from a political debate, or from a theological debate to a political debate, and led to the formation of some political ideals such as natural rights, the contract basis of a legitimate civil government, the consent of the governed, and the right to the resistance of tyranny. Dreisbach says the most well-known of these writings was the Vindiciae Contra Tyrannos, which was published in 1579 under a pseudonym Stephanus Junius Brutus. He says that the Founding Fathers, being educated men, would have been well aware of this writing and would have all read it, but it also influenced people like John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and John Milton. In fact, he said some people say that John Locke's writings are a secularized version of the Vindiciaes. According to Dreisbach, the Vindiciaes answered 4 questions regarding tyrannical governments and a Christian's response to them. And the answers were that subjects must not obey rulers that are contrary to God's law, that it is lawful to resist a ruler that violates the law of God, it's lawful to resist a ruler that oppresses or ruins the civil state, and the neighboring princes have a duty to assist in the resistance of a tyrannical government. Dreisbach then talks about the next influential work called the Lex Rex, or the Law and the Prince, wrote by the Scottish theologian Samuel Rutherford. The Lex Rex argued that kings do not have a divine right to rule, so that the law is over the kings. This affirmed the idea of a limited government, which is one that cannot rule contrary to God's law. According to a 2013 article in the Scottish Journal of Theology titled Resistance in Romans 13 in Samuel Rutherford's Lex Rex by Ryan McNally Lenz, Rutherford didn't submit to one type of government or form of government. He believed that God's providence determined the form of government, which would have struck a chord with the Founding Fathers, as the prevailing belief at the time was in God's providence, and they were in the throes of forming a new government. Rutherford also used the example of King Saul and David to illustrate a continuum of resistance of words, flight, passive disobedience, and active disobedience. Dreisbach then talks about the Stamp Act crisis that was causing the Americans in the 1760s to question whether the British government was in fact a tyrannical government, and as a Christian society, how they should respond to that. And he says that the Boston Massacre in March of 1770 really kind of cemented the idea in the Americans' minds that the British government was in fact tyrannical. As Dreisbach pointed out, that the Founding Fathers were well aware of the Vindiciaes and the Lex Rex, says that these would have framed their view of the appropriate Christian response to a tyrannical government, and their interpretations of the 2 most referenced Bible passages on civil authority, which are Romans 13, 1 through 7, and Acts 5:29. In James Byrd's book, A Sacred Scripture, Sacred War, published in 2013, also by Oxford Scholarship, he says, from patriotic Congregationalists in Boston and Angelicans in Williamsburg to Loyalist Methodists in London, preachers waged rhetorical battles over these passages. According to Dreisbach, probably the most famous and influential of these sermons was by Reverend Jonathan Mayhew at the Boston Old West Church a generation before the Boston Massacre. He even talked about John Adams writing about reading the sermon so many times it was part of who he was. In this sermon, Reverend Mayhew says that Scripture instructs obedience to a reasonable and just authority, but concludes that resistance to a tyrannical government was a glorious Christian duty. Dreisbach does point out that there was opposing ideas. People such as Reverend Jonathan Butcher still held more traditional views of Romans 13, like the views of Luther and Calvin, but their voices were drowned out in the rhetoric of the Revolution. So in conclusion, from Luther and Calvin's interpretation of Romans 13 and as a passive resistance as the appropriate response to the Vindiciae and the Lex Rex, evolving that idea to active disobedience was the appropriate response to a tyrannical government. We can see how the Founding Fathers and the Americans as a Christian society got to a point where their interpretation of the Bible allowed them to wage war in the name of liberty and freedom from a tyrannical government.